Hey everybody, and welcome back. I wanted to take a few minutes this morning and kind of talk about the fight between Jake Paul and Tyron Woodley that went down last night on Showtime Boxing. Obviously, Jake Paul picked up a split decision win over Tyron Woodley. A lot of people think Woodley won the fight. A lot of people think Jake Paul won the fight, and there's a lot going on here. So I'm going to try to... I personally felt like Jake Paul won. Like, when it went to the judges, I had no doubt in my mind that they were going to give it to Jake Paul. A, they're in Cleveland. B, Jake Paul just threw more often, right? And here's the other thing. Tyron Woodley is one of those guys who throughout his entire MMA career doesn't pull the trigger very often, and he's never been a volume guy, okay? He never sets things up with, he's never coming in and setting stuff up with his hands, right? He has big power and he knows how to throw. This was definitely a challenge for Jake Paul, don't get me wrong. But Woodley is not one of those guys who is constantly using his jabs and stuff to set up other things. He's a wrestler, really, right? And you got to think, when he drops guys like Darren Till with a big right hand, Wonderboy Thompson with a big right hand, Robbie Lawler with a big right hand. In an MMA fight, those openings are there because the gloves are smaller, right? But they're also there because when you're fighting Tyron Woodley, you have to worry about his wrestling pedigree, right? And that's going to open other things up. When you're if you're Stephen Wonderboy Thompson and you're fighting Woodley, do you think Woodley wants to stand and bang with you, or are you maybe a little worried that he might want to take it down to the ground, right? So when you have to worry about that threat of a takedown, it's going to leave opportunities for him, right? And to get hit, obviously, and Woodley capitalizes on that. But Woodley has never been a guy that's setting things up with beautiful boxing, and that's where he lands his power. I think that Woodley has always been I don't want to say timid, a little timid, right? He doesn't pull the trigger, and he's also very dense. He's very explosive. So when he does decide to finally throw, he has to be very, very selective about the shots that he throws. Because if you wing big and miss, it can wear you out. And if you're in an MMA fight, all these things guys start getting ahead of you, blah, 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 right? When you're in a boxing match, you have to use your punches to set things up. If all you're really planning on throwing is a big overhand right, if that's the only real threat that you can pose to Jake Paul to knock him out, then you have to have other weapons in your arsenal that can set that right hand up. And you guys saw throughout the fight, and this is what I really thought made the difference in the judges' eyes and why I thought Jake Paul was going to win. Throughout the fight, Woodley was really focused on throwing singular shots, or he might throw one or two punches together, whereas you would see, not all the time, but more often, Jake Paul was throwing boxing combinations together. And yes, they weren't all landing, but he was outboxing Tyron Woodley, right? I think if you look at it in terms of what a fight would be, Tyron Woodley probably won the fight as a whole, right? He hurt Jake more than Jake hurt him. He was pushing the action. He controlled the octagon. He controlled the pace. But don't forget also, guys, yes, he landed a big shot that knocked Jake against the ropes and stuff too, but there was a moment where you could tell that Jake Paul was getting tired. And in that moment, that's when Tyron Woodley needed to turn up the volume, put the pressure on him, and start unloading a little bit more, and he didn't, right? He didn't. And Jake Paul, throughout the entire fight, kept throwing punches. And another thing that Woodley didn't do at all, he didn't really work the body, and Jake Paul was constantly working the body. He worked the body much more effectively than Tyron Woodley did, okay? So I felt like Jake Paul, in terms of what a boxing match is and how they typically score it, I didn't have any problem with the decision at all, right? And like I said, and guys, here's another thing, right? To highlight the difference between MMA and boxing. Like I said, when Tyron Woodley is fighting guys like Darren Till and Wonderboy, they're worried that he might take him down, and that's going to leave openings for him to land big shots, right? But if you guys ever watched Gordon Ryan versus Pat Downey, the wrestling match that they had, Gordon Ryan, for those of you who don't know, is in my opinion and most people's opinion, I think it's unanimously agreed upon that Gordon Ryan is the greatest no-gi grappler of all time, right? Greatest no-gi submission artist of all time for sure. Greatest at attack, all these things, right? Great jiu-jitsu player. But in a wrestling match, when you change the rules, Pat Downey wiped the floor with him, man. And it's because Pat Downey now doesn't have to worry about Gordon Ryan getting to his back and establishing some type of guard and working from there, right? Because it's just a different rule set that you're going into. And that's where Woodley ran into problems. It's the same kind of similar thing. Yes, these two have things in common, and yes, Woodley has power. But when Woodley is forced to only use his hands to set up his power shots. You saw that he struggled a little bit, and he looked a little bit confused to me in there. And I think that Jake Paul just looked like he had more confidence in his boxing ability and his ability to throw combinations and his ability to set things up. Okay, so it's like when... And honestly, that's why it is so smart for Jake Paul to continue to fight these MMA fighters. Like Ben Askren was a massive mismatch. Tyron Woodley, though, a little bit more realistic. And now you do have to start looking at at his boxing skills and going, okay, this guy can fight. Like, this guy knows how to box now, right? And I don't even think that we're at a point now where we need to start throwing. I felt like Tyron Woodley versus Jake Paul was a very evenly matched fight. Like, that fight is where Jake Paul needs to be in his career right now if he wants to pursue this. Like, I thought it was actually a pretty good matchup. So now what do? You let him train a little bit more and you let him fight. I honestly think it's going to be somebody else from the MMA community for a couple of reasons. One, if you throw Jake Paul up, I know a lot of people just want to see this guy get fucking murked, right? But it's not like, if he's going to approach this, he has to approach it intelligently. And that's going to mean fighting guys who were on a similar skill level to himself, right? And challenging himself. He did that in Tyron Woodley. I think Jake was a more skilled boxer, and we got to see that. And Woodley, we also got to see last night, there's a lot that we saw last night. We got to see that Jake Paul can go 8 rounds, right? Like, yes, he got tired, and yes, there were moments. There are things that he needs to work on. Like, his output slowed down a little bit. You can see that his technique got a little bit more sloppy as the fight wore on, but he can do it. He can bounce back from taking a big shot, and he kept fighting. Man, I'm telling you, it is not easy to go in there and get cracked like that and keep fucking going. You learned that Jake Paul last night is tough. You learned that he knows how to box. And in my opinion, he's fighting guys that are right on the level he needs. I think the next move for him is to fight another MMA fighter. The skill gap, a guy who's maybe a little bit more proficient in boxing, right? And a guy who he uses a little bit more volume to set up his shots. Maybe it's a guy who's a little bit closer in size to Jake Paul. It's got to be one of those things, right? Like, it has to fulfill one of those things. Because the headline is going to have to be, maybe Woodley was too small. Oh, maybe Woodley was this, right? So now you have to, like I said, Woodley's timid. Like, that's a legit knock against him. And in a boxing match, being timid like that and being too selective with your shots, if Jake just has to worry about the overhand right and nothing else, he's going to have an easy time defending it and slipping out of the way. Man, I think that you're going to see him fight somebody like a Nate Diaz, or probably not Nate, because I think the UFC still has plans for Nate. And if Jake Paul beats Nate Diaz, that's not going to look good for future fights for Nate Diaz. But it's got to be somebody who has a legit boxing pedigree and somebody who has a really good gas tank and somebody who's not going to be afraid to throw. The thing that was irritating me about watching Woodley last night is there were moments, like after he rocked Jake Paul, and you could just feel that Paul was tired, and there were moments for Woodley to really put his foot on the gas and start pressing this thing and maybe take advantage of it. Woodley wasn't realizing that Jake Paul was not really a danger. I don't want to say not dangerous anymore, because if somebody lands clean on you, it could fucking rock you. But I feel like Woodley had a massive power advantage and a massive, there was just a massive disparity in how fresh they both were. And I feel like Woodley missed an opportunity to really push the pace and potentially put Jake Paul away. But again, that's pretty par for the course if you're looking at Tyron Woodley's career. I mean, fuck, man. Jake Paul, obviously, skilled boxer, right? I would say he's like, I don't know, purple belt level boxer, man, if you're looking at it in jiu-jitsu terms. But I don't think there's any need to throw. You have to give this fucking kid props. He's been training, and he stepped in there against a former welterweight world champion in the UFC. You don't think that's scary? You don't think this kid had nerves when he was going out to the octagon? You don't think you would, even if you had gone through all the training and everything after only 3 years? He's 24. You have to give the kid props, and this is just going to keep growing. If Woodley knocked Jake Paul out in spectacular fashion last night or something, this whole thing comes crashing down. But he didn't, and he won, right? And you got to see things that he can work on and improve. And fuck, man, you start looking at Conor McGregor, like I said, Diaz. There's guys that are going to match up well for him. And also, after the fight ended, I noticed that I saw that Tyron Woodley went up to him and was like, "Oh, I want a rematch, blah blah blah." Do you guys want a rematch? Fuck no, you don't want a rematch, because part of you definitely wants to see what's next for Jake Paul. Like, what's the next challenge? And B, that fight was like, here's the thing. Woodley is going to fight the same fight the next time they go at it, right? It's not like he's going to go out and fucking make this miraculous at 38 years old. He's not going to make all these miraculous transitions and suddenly look a lot better. I would say that if I would actually favor Jake Paul more going into the rematch because he's younger and he's going to be making much larger improvements over the next few years than Tyron Woodley's going to be able to at 38 years old. So if they fight again in a year, 6 months, I think Jake Paul's going to beat him even more cleanly, right? I don't think Woodley wins. I think Woodley goes in, he looks confused again because Jake's going to be developing more skills. He's going to be keeping things out in his face more often, and he's already going to have seen Woodley. And like I'm saying, it's like Woodley had an entire career where he was able to set up the right hand because of the threat of the takedown, and when you take that away from him, I don't think he's going to be able to develop the necessary skills to just run through Jake Paul in a rematch. For me personally, I want to see what's next for Jake Paul. I want to see him move on. I want to see what he's got. Let's keep this fucking train rolling, man. It keeps bringing money in. And also, I loved how this kid, I know you can say whatever you want, blah, 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 blah. I love how he acted after the fight. I loved how he was respectful. He apologized for all the shit talking to Tyron Woodley. This kid is trying to make money, man. And this is what fighters in the fight game do. They talk shit on each other. He has to be talking shit on people in the UFC in order to get them interested. Whoever fights Jake Paul is also going to get fucking paid. And Jake Paul keeps bringing light to stuff like fighter pay and stuff like that. I think this is fucking amazing. Honestly. At first I was like, this is a fucking shit show. But after last night, you can tell that Jake Paul is at the very least taking this seriously. And his boxing skills are better than a guy who may not be the best boxer in terms of skill, but who definitely has power, who definitely knows how to throw a punch, and who was definitely, like, Tyron Woodley was a threat. Like, he could have knocked Jake Paul out, right? So, I don't know, man. I just think that, like, a rematch doesn't do Jake's career a lot of good. It does nothing for Woodley. I think that Woodley's chances are worse in a rematch because, like I said, Jake's going to keep getting better and he's going to start acquiring more skills and he's going to become more comfortable with his footwork, whereas Woodley, it's going to be hard to bridge that gap in my personal opinion, man. But either way, I don't know. I'm rambling, saying a lot of the same shit over and over again, but I'm having a hard time knocking Jake Paul this morning, man. I have to give him props for going in there and stepping in against Tyron Woodley. That has to be fucking scary. I thought he looked relatively good considering how long he's been training and the opponent that he was going up against. I thought he stayed relatively composed considering how explosive Tyron Woodley is. Also, you got to think about, like, the shell shock, like, or the shock factor. Like, I'm standing across from fucking Tyron Woodley, and I thought he handled that well, man. I got really, honest to God, I don't have any bad things to say about Jake Paul this morning, man. Hats off to him. He fought a good fight, and I hate to admit it, but I'm excited to see what's coming next. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments. I know there's going to be a lot of people disagreeing with me on this shit, but it is what it is, man. I will catch you guys later. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the like button. A lot of you are probably going to hit the dislike button on this one, but shit, man. I'll catch you guys later. Thank you again. Bye-bye.